code is law has a fundamental flaw, which people will exploit the code interpretation for their own personal gain and will try to capture the system.
Well, I don't know, Rafa. Maybe our waters are very different. Maybe we're swimming in completely different streams, you know?
When did you know that was the thing that really got you excited?
The ability to collectively govern a product or data or tech in general, it was such an exciting concept to me.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see the kind of people that are drawn to the chaos and instilling order in some kind of way.
What do you mean by like decentralized governance body?
The ZKsync governance system has a 3-body governance system. So
what do you see as the vibe in DAOs these days? One word. Hi, I'm Eugene.
And I'm Jamilya.
And this is the Governance Futures podcast, where we explore the past, present, and future of decentralized governance.
This week, we have the pleasure of speaking with Rafa and Shelby from ZKsync. Rafa is Director and Governance Lead at the ZKsync Association, where he supports protocol governance design, token mechanics, and operations. His work spans the entire governance system design, from contracts to legal architecture for regulatory alignment and scalable processes for decentralization. Rafa brings a background in organizational design and analytics to help ZKsync evolve governance into public infrastructure, credible, composable, and built for the long term. Based in Berlin, he's always ready to share stories of niche to online lore and previous research on digital swarms.
And Shelby is the governance experience lead for ZKsync Governance. She is responsible for all things governance UX, resource management and creation, delegate coordination, and supporting token mechanics for any token programs. She's previously worked on governance at Radworks, which is part of RadicleDAO, bringing 3 years of governance operations experience to help launch and cultivate the ZKsync governance system. Shelby enjoys flat whites, a groovy house beat, and contributing to the grand experiment that is decentralized governance.
This was a great conversation where we started with Shelby and Rafa's journey to governance, which is always fun to hear.
Yeah, it's cool seeing that no two paths into governance are the same.
That's true. We spent most of the conversation diving into aspects of ZKsync governance architecture, from the legal design with the Austrian Association to how they both see the future of governance.
And before we get into the interview, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please subscribe wherever you're listening, leave us a review, share with a friend, or reach out to us if you want to chat.
And now, here's the chat with Rafa and Shelby.
Welcome, Shelby and Rafa. To start the conversation today, I kind of wanted to touch on both of your backgrounds and journeys into the space. Shelby, you were working as a governance facilitator at Radicle, had experience volunteering, and even did a master's focused on digital governance and digitalization. And Rafa, you had consulted on chain organizations around governance and conducted research, especially in a very public way, and contributed to ecosystem building efforts at Mirror and beyond. And this is obviously all before both of you joined ZKsync. And for both of you, looking back on your journeys and the paths you took, when did your interest in governance really start to crystallize? When did you know that was the thing that really got you excited? And yeah, Shelby, if you don't mind kicking us off, that would be great.
yeah, sounds good. And thanks for having us. I got into governance a few years into my journey into blockchain, and I actually started working on it or becoming an operator before I actually even contributed to a governance system, which was kind of might seem backwards. But yeah, I was lucky enough to help contribute to build out the RadicleDAO, back then now known as Radworks, governance system. And I actually didn't know a lot about governance before joining. I was just very excited to have an opportunity to start working in the ecosystem. So I learned a lot in those first few months. But what really drew me to it, and what has kept me here 4 or so years later, is just the concept of shared ownership and influence, or the kind of collective, the ability to collectively govern a product or data, or tech in general, was such an exciting concept to me, especially after being very jaded and disheartened after the whole kind of Web 2 era of Google and Facebook, and so that whole premise was really exciting to me. And then all of the mess that comes with governance and governance coordination has kept me here, because I find it fascinating to be able to work on new human coordination primitives.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see the kind of people that are drawn to the chaos and instilling order in some kind of way. But yeah, Rafa would also love to kind of hear your origin story of sorts.
So I don't know if this is a well-known story, but it is a story I've shared before. There's kind of like two important pivot points, I guess, in my career around looking at human coordination. The most recent one was I was working with artisans in the island in Puerto Rico, which is where I'm from originally. And I realized that they were really restricted in terms of the distribution that they had digitally and to the entire online economy. And I was trying to think of ways to get them online, but I wanted to do it in a way where the supporting entity or organization wasn't necessarily charging them a tax for participating. So there's a lot of conversations that I had with the co-founders of a nonprofit called Obras del País around how we can create an experience where the artisans themselves can connect to consumers and they're not necessarily charged a lot because traditionally people who sold artisanal crafts would charge upwards of like 50% of type of fee for any of those sales. And during those conversations, I was thinking about how can we automate this? How can we create an organization that's sufficiently lean? And that actually intersected with the rise of DAOs back in 2020 and 2021. But
Mm.
before that, the back when I was 18, um, the I was working at my parents wanted me to work and to learn what working was like. So they got me a minimum wage job with my uncle, and the job was to count screws all summer. So it was my job was to sit
Exhilarating work.
exhilarating work. I had to sit down and I had to count screws and put. I had a barrel of screws that I had to split into little packets of 100. And I was like, there's no way this is like positive ROI for this organization. Like that, this is just like excess like value just being like poured down the drain. At one point I asked, can I weigh the screws instead of count them? But my uncle being being playing the role of I had to learn what a minimum wage job was, didn't let me actually count them. And so that kind of led to this entire rabbit hole or this turtle question, as one of my friends here in Berlin mentions, of how do humans actually coordinate, and then later on what the role of the internet is and networked economies in changing the way that humans coordinate. So I ended up working in DAOs, basically trying to both understand how we coordinate and create a better world for everyone, how businesses actually create value surplus in today's economy, how the internet impacts that, and most importantly, how those tools and systems can actually be used to create better environments for the people who contribute to those ecosystems and better relationships and better power dynamics.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I guess to follow up then and to think about some of the research and writing that you've done, and especially where you've talked around, swarms often forming not because of necessarily strict rules or protocols, but in the kind of absence of things. And people will just kind of find whatever's around them and make it work because they have that desire to coordinate or whatever is that binding energy of the swarm. And so how has that kind of changed your way of thinking about designing governance systems, especially in Web3, where there was this such a strong code is law mantra in, the DAO days in 2016?
I can't remember who wrote about hardness in Ethereum. I have to look it up. But when we think about like digital infrastructure, so how do people coordinate? Well, people first and foremost coordinate based on the environment that they sit in, based on the architecture that surrounds them. In digital environments, that some of that architecture is softer and some of it is harder. on-chain being slightly harder, but not necessarily, right? User interfaces also create a lot of pressure in terms of what patterns of coordination can exist. And so one of the things that I think is really important is it's more important to be aware of the water that you're swimming in and what currents exist and what the architecture of the world around you is and how you can influence that, then try to get the fish, or in our case, the crowd, or the agents, or the people in these digital environments to move in a specific way. And so the design principles that we bring to kind of the ZKsync ecosystem is we're constantly thinking not of trying to convince people to to participate in a specific way, but how can we create an environment? How can we create the hardness of a specific architecture that produces good outcomes, an infinite game that people want to continue playing, and something that creates a sustainable path for the protocol itself? So, from the research in online swarms, I guess one of the main learnings is asking, okay, where does your horizon of control sit as an architect for digital spaces? And a lot of that has to do with the user interface. And specifically in protocols, it has to do with the contracts that you're kind of deploying and the affordances of those specific contracts.
Yeah, that really makes sense. And I guess when thinking about these, the environment or the experiences that kind of shape governance overall, Shelby, I wanted to turn to you and ask a question regarding, the governance roast that I know you had been part of previously, and thinking about this element of, the spaces and experiences we can and, could or should be intentionally designing within our space, whether it's, within the ecosystem that, we're particularly working for and the outcomes of the DAO, or whether it's just to kind of set these kind of just broad cultural norms. And yeah, I'd be interested in hearing, if you don't mind sharing, a little more about that experience and what it was like, and the role you think that can play for folks in Web3 if we start doing things like that a little more systematically.
Yeah, absolutely. So that governance roast that you're referring to was actually just one event or one part of a community hub that I helped organize and host at DevCon last year. It was the Governance Geeks Community Hub. So shout out to all the governance geeks who are listening, who attended. The purpose of creating spaces or organizing spaces like this Governance Geeks Hub and to organize different sessions and conversations with governance minded folks is really, in my experience over the years and having organized a few different versions of these meetups or spaces, having like focused conversations with really high context people on specific governance topics or challenges has been extremely useful. And while it's obviously important to remember that everybody's governance system is different or there's different implications involved in different ecosystems, to be able to come together and share experiences, learn from each other, exchange resources, recommendations, but also just to vent and to have kind of a safe space with other people who you are either working on governance or participating in governance, is very valuable, not only professionally, but also as a human. So I really enjoy helping coordinate these spaces, and not only because it brings a lot of personal value, but I've gotten a lot of feedback that it's very useful for other folks as well, especially so early on in this experiment that we're calling decentralized governance. Even though we've been around, I guess, for a few years now, it's, I would still say, in its adolescence and like mostly experimental phase, and there's still a
Yeah.
lot to learn. So having those spaces is important.
Eugene, were you able to go to the to the roast?
I unfortunately had to miss the roast. I made the very regrettable decision of helping co-organize or being part of organizing two spaces, so I had to keep running between one and the other. And there was a thing I had to lead at the grant related one. Unfortunately, I was really bummed to have missed that because I know there was I think a DAO roast that, if I'm remembering correctly, Isaac from Seals 911 and from Shield 3 and I think it was him who organized it previously, and that was another one I had to miss. And just both sounded like such great events because I think that I don't know. It seems like where we've come from with code as law being such a mantra, at least in the earlier days, it's still taking us a while to truly understand that intersection of, the technical protocol level or token mechanic level, and then the soft side and the cultural design that gets put on top of that so that each feeds to the other. It still feels like there's a lot of the space that figures like, oh, we designed the right thing and then people just fit to that right thing. And it's like, that's a lovely idea, but that's not always necessarily how it plays out. So yeah, hearing both of kind of your last answers gets me excited for where we're about to head with the conversation in terms of, unpacking a little more of what y'all have been cooking up at ZKsync and really getting at that kind of maybe circling back to this intersection of, the token mechanic, the fundamental pipelines, the pipes that you're building, so to say, and then like the human aspect and just how humans gather around it and how those swarms form and get to work together. I'll pass it off to Jamilya to take us to the next part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. I have a quick follow-up. Shelby, can we expect some golf burn event during Argentina Dev Connect this year?
Let's throw out some alpha.
I will say there are whispers amongst some of the past organizers from the Gov Geeks Hub at DevCon last year who are excited and motivated to do it again. So I will
Fingers crossed.
confidently say yes. You can expect something Dev
Nice.
Connect in our Buenos Aires.
If you're part of the group, then you'll know.
Okay.
You'll get the invitation.
No, but that's
There's no shadowy governance cabal. Don't worry about it, y'all.
No.
Just one reflection, Eugene, on what you just mentioned, and like something that I think that came out of the conversations from last year and also conversations this year across governance operators is I think that what's really happened, and maybe to set the stage for where we are today, is that the initial model that was ideated from DAOs in, let's say, 2019 with FWB, with Forefront, with Cabin DAO, has only recently, after 4 or 5 years, now come to a certain level of maturity, both from kind of like it's operationalized in a sense. You can run a playbook to kind of like launch an on-chain organization with like token holders and delegates, or with validators or provers or network proof of stake. That playbook has just kind of matured. And I think within that maturity level, we've realized that code is law is one side of the spectrum. But most organizations benefit from what I would say code and law together for a broader design space. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, we've now been able to reap the consequences of the model. So now we know deep down, especially as governance operators, what the positive and negative consequences of this model is. And we're kind of at an inflection point, which is, where do we go from here? And I'm kind of excited. So we've done some stuff at ZKsync, which we'll get into. But I think to set the stage, we are at the point where the first generation or the second generation of DAOs, because the first one was 2017 with the DAO, so second generation has been somewhat matured operationally somewhat, and we've been able to live through the consequences of the design choices back from 2019 and 2020.
To your previous quote that we should be aware of the waters that we're swimming in rather than focusing on getting the fish to move in a particular way, what do you think, let's say, the average Web3 governance contributor awareness of the waters that we're swimming in right now, in your opinion?
I mean, I would say, okay, so I'll flip it over to you guys. So right now, if you were to describe Jamilya, like, the main things that kind of define your actions within a governance system, what are maybe some of the things that come to mind to you? How
Oh,
would you
well, the first
describe the
thing,
waters that you're swimming that you're kind of swimming in right
well,
now?
I don't know, Rafa, maybe our waters are very different. Maybe we're swimming in completely different streams, you know?
What would be top of mind for you?
Well, okay, I think I would say that generally people are very much focused on, let's say, let's use the same allegory, on the little stream, the little river. And very often we're forgetting that we're all part of the bigger ocean. So that would be my answer. And now back to you, Rafa.
Yeah, so I think there's a sort of myopia, I think is the word. I don't know if I've ever said that word out loud, but there is this sense of localization that you kind of like only know your own kind of like stream and your own waters. And very often, like you get this narrow view, like you go to a governance portal like Agora, Tally, Aragon, and you see that you need to vote and you need to choose yes or no, or maybe you need to do that. And you often think that that is the governance system. But there's also like an entire other kind of like part of governance system where, for example, protocol partners participate in roadmap development even before there's a vote for a protocol upgrade, or and that governance system is very clear potentially, or very explicit for the partner itself, but not necessarily so explicit for the delegates. I think the water that we often miss is the fact of how influenced we are by kind of the ecosystem that we've normalized. Like crypto Twitter, for example, exerts a humongous influence in terms of governance processes. Regulatory ambiguity has been something that has significantly shaped a lot of decisions in how we manage governance, has changed the language that we use in documentation. Every blog post checked by legal to make sure that you don't step on the Howey test by accident because you don't want to like fall into that. I think those are some of the environmental factors that we need to create more awareness of, because they do influence what we do on a daily basis, and they often lead to decisions which are often don't necessarily make sense. Like you're like, oh, why did they post that on Twitter? And it's because, well, it's not really for the governance system. They're posting it because crypto Twitter is expecting a post about whatever it is. Why did they word the docs that way? And it's like, well, actually, because they've been reading all the legal documentation, they're trying to comply with 130 different jurisdictions at exactly the same time. And then you're trying to do your best to, both be accessible and be legally compliant at the same time. But that's definitely, I don't know, Shelby, what are some that come to mind for you?
Yeah, I guess like the thing that's coming to mind for me, just listening to you, both of you talk, is recognizing that yes, we are swimming in different streams. Every governance system is governing a different set of things, maybe to different levels, or like different levels within a silo. So, and I feel like the space has kind of fallen into, or like the DAO world or DAO participants have kind of fallen into like a trap of comfort, of an assumption, of assuming this is how it works in this DAO, and it's kind of how it works in every DAO. But that is, and maybe that did work, that assumption did work for the last few years, but that's starting to change. And that's creating additional tension, because folks or delegates or other stakeholders and participants are just expecting one thing to be the same, or something to be the same across all DAOs, but every ecosystem has their own reasons for doing things different ways. And I mean, even with ZKsync and the launch of the ZKsync governance system in September of last year, we very quickly realized that that was an assumption a lot of folks brought coming to ZKsync who have participated in other ecosystems where things are a little different here. So having to kind of mitigate that and adjust how we discuss things, and create additional resources and stuff. Yeah, that's, I guess, just the main thing that was coming to mind listening to you guys talk.
Yeah, and going back to the point about like the current playbook has quite matured. When we started the design of the ZKsync system back in, I think it started back in October 2023. there are basic assumptions that we tried to go back to the basics. We're saying, what's the right legal structure? We ended up with an Austrian association, and we can talk a little bit about that in a second, but what's the relationship between foundation, between labs, between other protocol development organizations? What does a security council really need to be? We have definitions of stage 1 decentralization. Are those the same definitions that we think that will exist in 2 years? What are we actually designing for? Are we going to mint the token? We'll talk also about cap minters. And even it was very difficult to take a step back and think about how to become aware of some of the core assumptions that were kind of default. Like, do you launch with governance on day one? What's the best way to do an airdrop 3 years into or 4 years into the airdrop meta when you have industrial level farming that is basically trying to game your protocol for multiple years, right? And those questions still come up today. If you were going to launch protocol and go through the decentralization process right now so you can create a decentralized blockchain organization, you have to also once again go back to those basic assumptions, and writing down those basic assumptions, being aware of them, it's a hard job, and it becomes a harder job the longer that you're in the industry because you just take it for granted.
Yeah, and I think that prepares us beautifully to just go into our next question on the organizational design. And you guys are doing it quite uniquely compared to other ecosystems. So from the Austrian association that you mentioned, Rafa, to ZK governance program systems and Borgs, you've created sort of dual stack system, legally enforceable on-chain governance. So it would be great if you guys could walk us through the choice of Austrian association model and how this concept of extraordinary membership fits into the broader idea of reasonable decentralization.
Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about the overall level, and maybe Shelby, you can talk a little bit about the delegate relationships to token assembly and such. At a high level, we had a couple of years back, there was kind of the UkiDAO incident where the voters and the token holders were accused or found as part of an unincorporated kind of partnership. And so we wanted to find a novel type of solution that enabled that could launch a token, manage the governance system, but also try to minimize the risks of the participants in that process. And that's how we ended up with the Austrian Association. And that we decoupled basically governance and token issuance and regulatory alignment from foundation responsibilities of strategic partnerships and other types of ecosystem initiatives. That was a big part of the overall strategy. Again, thinking that we wanted ZKsync to be able to survive regardless of whatever happened to any of the legal entities that were related to it. The philosophy here was that we were trying really hard to get away from just code and really think about the affordances that different jurisdictions and different legal frameworks provided us. And I think that's really what we've been trying to innovate on, where, as you mentioned before, we want governance procedures, which are enforceable procedures, and that enforcement can be either via software or via legal relationships, and ideally at the intersection of both of them. And the Austrian Association then became an excellent legal structure that then provided a path for delegates to become what we call extraordinary members. So together they become the delegates who opt into to that extraordinary membership, become the association token assembly. And so they kind of
Sorry, how can they exit? What is the procedure for them just exiting?
It's very simple. Just on the governance portal, they can click a button so they can participate, or they can resign. You just click an active or inactive flag. So Shelby, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of those rights and responsibilities.
Yeah. So as Rafa's already kind of previewed here, the Austrian association model was very attractive for many reasons, but also in particular for this special type of membership called extraordinary membership, which allows for participants to be able to opt in to becoming a member, which in theory offers then a layer of liability protection while participating in ZKsync governance. So designing for the issues or frictions that we observed with the UkiDAO case, and also concerns across the industry with governance participation and uncertain regulatory environments in regards to governance participation. The reason this was chosen was to try to address that point. Disclaimer, this has not been battle tested. If anything ever happens, we can't 100% certain say that nothing bad will happen, but the design principle is there and is in place to try to protect and also incentivize governance participation and participants.
Thank you so much. And I have a follow-up question here on your ZK governance program system. So if I understand it correctly, this is the framework that introduces legal contracting and accountability for proposal execution. So could you elaborate a little bit more on that and whether you think this kind of opt-in legal structure could help DAOs mature? And as you've mentioned, Shelby, learn from other examples. Rafa, you mentioned OKDAO, or whether it reintroduces the risk of traditional gatekeeping, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So for people who are listening, what Jamilya is referring to is ZK or this governance program system is it's a Cayman Foundation. And what it allows is that whenever a proposal is approved via the governance system overall, whoever is participating as part of the steerco, as a service provider, has an entity to engage with. So in a lot of on-chain organizations, you ask the question, okay, so if a proposal is approved or if a program gets kickstarted, is there any type of legal accountability with regards to this? And in most cases, the answer is no. You just send tokens to a multisig and hope that multisig adheres to the proposal execution. In some on-chain organizations, the DAO or the on-chain organization contracts with, let's say, the foundation. There's other legal structures that exist. In our case, specifically for ZKsync, ZKGPS is kind of this legal counterparty. So whenever a program gets kicked off, you have a letter of engagement and you make sure that the people participating don't just have an on-chain handshake where there was funds sent to a multisig, but you actually have a legal agreement that says, yes, I'm committing to delivering these services, and the on-chain organization may be providing a token supply or specific tokens in exchange for those specific services.
Did you guys have any, unexpected outcomes or interactions or people not complying with rules? No?
Not so far. I think, if anything, everybody has a sigh of relief, because it's when you write a proposal, you often don't have all the specific terms that you want in it. You're trying to keep you're optimizing the proposal for readability and accessibility, not for enforcement and for clarity. And so the response that we've received has been very positive, where whenever a service provider has a letter of engagement, they're like, oh, great. Someone wrote down that I will get paid if I do work for this steerco. That's awesome. That's good. It gives you a sense of security.
Also, on the side of delegates or the token assembly, it also adds to the accountability. We'll talk a little bit more about the kind of on-chain technical accountability that is kind of baked into our token governance system, I'm sure, at some point during this conversation. But because anybody who would be a signer on a multisig, for example, who is managing a specific token program, if they mint the tokens and run, they could be held legally liable, which gives a little bit more assurance and comfort on the token assembly side
Not
as well.
battle tested, but
Not battle tested yet, but in theory.
but we're you know we'll try.
I have a question on, other things that, in your opinion, set ZKsync governance aside from other protocols. Your credo is freedom, prosperity, and I forgot what was the third. Could you remind me?
Freedom, progress, and prosperity.
Right. Thank you so much. And I'm curious about your opinion because it seems like in different ecosystems, more or less, all of the values could be boiled down to decentralization, inclusion of diverse voices, security of the protocol, efficiency in many of them. There was a study published by Metagov. We mentioned it in other episodes that they analyzed constitutions of different DAOs, and they've highlighted that it seems like decentralization, one of the core values, yet nobody really defined decentralization. Nobody really understood how different communities understand that. So before we dive a bit deeper into specifics of your governance, Shelby, do you have anything that for you, for example, if someone asked you who is new to governance, to explain in simple terms, what is it unique about what you do at ZKsync that makes you guys just stand out compared to other ecosystems?
Yeah, there's a few things that come to mind. I guess the first is really just on-chain enforceability and transparency. So all governance at ZKsync is on-chain. And is governed fully by the token assembly for protocol upgrades, for token governance, and even for meta governance decisions as well, which we call GovOps. Governance is all on chain. The way the governance system is designed is tied very closely to an additional value or maybe kind of like catchphrase that is very popular in the ZKsync ecosystem, which is don't trust, verify. And you notice that in the token governance model that has been developed and deployed and that we're experimenting with now, to be able to programmatically enforce a process rather than having to manually manage it or trust specific parties to have to manage these systems or agreements that they said they would do things a certain way or only spend so much money at a certain time. Like the way the system is designed and what makes us unique, and we'll dive into some more details, technical details as to why this is, especially in regards to token governance and the cap minter token mechanics system that is used for token governance, allows for a lot more modularity and trust minimization in how accountability and process is managed within the ZKsync governance system.
I was gonna say, I think per your comment on like the ZK credo,
Great credo.
it's weird.
I'm always curious to ask, governance people about how they phrase the philosophy, the vision, because it tells a lot about the idea behind the architectural design of governance systems. So yeah, I'm honestly, the shortest one I've seen so far. Usually it's like pages and pages of ideology behind,
So
which is not better
I
either.
think the core belief is we believe that freedom, and within freedom, what I mean is like free competition and contribution is really the driver of innovation and progress, which then delivers prosperity to the participants. And I think that those values we take very seriously in terms of how we design the system. We designed a system that permissionlessly people can contribute protocol upgrades. It doesn't mean that there's going to be 1,000 protocol upgrades submitted right now. The protocol is complicated, but for long-term sustainability, what we want is for that openness of participation and innovation to be like the path that we're taking. I think that code is law has a fundamental flaw, which people will exploit the code interpretation for their own personal gain and will try to capture the system. We know that's true, like manipulate the rules for their own benefit. And so one of the things that is unique about ZKsync, well, we can argue whether it's unique or not, but we believe in kind of like mission-centered governance, and that's where the guardians come into play, which is a council of highly trusted and values-centered individuals who can veto proposals in the ecosystem if they're malicious or if they're obviously misaligned and trying to like cause harm long term or short term to the ecosystem. And the guardians serve as kind of the central checkpoint. Other ecosystems have a veto address, or they have a primary, type of role that can only submit proposals. I think that serves essentially the same purpose, which is you're trying to maintain mission alignment in a permissionless system. We took the veto route in terms of the design, and we have on-chain enforcement of that privilege and that right. That doesn't mean that privilege for the guardians can't be revoked, that there can be a protocol upgrade which removes the guardians at some point. But the system itself right now includes this entity that steers the orientation. There hasn't been a single veto since we launched, and I don't expect a veto in the near term either. But it's really important as a deterrence so that people understand that the mission alignment orientation is something that is taken seriously, and every proposal is kind of reviewed around it. The guardians themselves, they can't submit proposals. The only thing they can do is kind of like high judges, they can review something and say, hey, this is actually going to be bad for the ecosystem.
Do you mind sharing a bit on how the guardians are selected and what are the checks on the guardians?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a blog post on the selection criteria that I'll just read through a couple of them. So, steadfast personal visions. So, we wanted individuals that had ambitious visions for the crypto industry and today's institutions around transparency, mutual accountability, public responsibility. We wanted people who were active advocates for cypherpunk values, people who had distribution and reach and were recognized voices with in-depth technical knowledge, and ideally experienced entrepreneurs, active ZKsync builders and partners, and who have an established trust with their communities. So the guardians were initially appointed by the ZKsync Association. So the inception, they can be changed with a protocol upgrade, and that's where kind of the check and balance here is basically that protocol upgrade process where there is an expectation that guardians are only going to intervene. But the fact that we have 8 means that any individual agenda is not the dominant agenda of the guardian. So you can have someone who has a specific interpretation of the ZK credo and the ZK vision. That doesn't mean that a specific proposal will be vetoed. You have to have a 5 out of 8 threshold for at least 5 of the guardians need to say, we believe this is infringing on the ZK Credo vision for them to be able to take action.
You mentioned ambitious individuals being part of the Guardians. This reminded me of a tweet I saw from Nick Almond, who is doing governance at Solana. And I don't remember the exact quote, but I think it was something like, how does one govern an army of geniuses or something like that? So it's always a question, how do you facilitate governance in the groups or security councils where there's just so many different talented people? And I want to pass my question to Shelby now because I wanted to hear more about this 3-body decentralized governance, which from my understanding consists of guardians. Rafa just gave us an overview of Security Council and Token Assembly. So could you walk us through the differentiations and what do you mean by like decentralized governance body? How truly decentralized are they in their decision-making powers?
Yeah, happy to go over that. So as you mentioned, the ZKsync governance system has a 3-body governance system. So the first body is the token assembly, which is just the term that we use for delegates and token holders who are a part of the governance system. The second body is the Security Council, as Rafa mentioned, and the third is the Guardians. How all of those 3 interact with the governance system: token assembly votes on all proposals. The Guardians are able to veto all proposals, And the Security Council actually only has final approval power over protocol upgrades. So we actually have 3 separate governors, which is really cool, a really cool design primitive, because you're allowed to have unique parameters for each of those governors and those different proposal types based on different needs. So the Security Council actually only interacts with the protocol governor, and only interacts like with with the purpose to approve protocol upgrades. Yeah, so the Security Council and the Guardians are the most, I guess, closed off of the 2 bodies. They do have, both of them do have a requirement or expectation of transparency in any decision that they do make, and the process of approval for protocol upgrades. For example, the Security Council we see a lot more active because, as Rafa mentioned, there haven't been any vetoes, so the Guardians haven't had to share much about their opinions yet. But so what we do see more often is the Security Council in the process of approving their protocol that have been approved by the Token Assembly. They will share reasoning or information around why a protocol upgrade is passed, or if they do decide not to execute it, why not. The Token Assembly, like I said, is made up of all of the delegates and token holders within the ZKsync ecosystem. That is anybody who, just like in every other ecosystem, anybody who holds the ZK token is able to delegate that voting power either to themselves or to another delegate. What we've seen is since launch, actually, we've had a pretty great spread, I would say, of in terms of how many folks are meeting proposal threshold, the kind of diversity in delegates that we're seeing involved in the governance system, and how that's evolved over time has been really great to see. For example, there's in the top like 20 or 30-ish delegates, there's a really healthy mix of ZK chains, different builders in the ecosystem who are contributing to the ZKsync protocol or ecosystem, professional delegates, and also other supporters or kind of fans of the ZKsync system. So to see that, and also to have, I believe we have 28 delegates who currently have a proposal, who meet the proposal threshold. So that means 28 delegates are able to submit proposals, which is a pretty big number considering how big ZKsync is. So yeah, that's on that front. I would say, there's always like further decentralization, and there's always the argument of, are delegates actually decentralizing because you're centralizing voting power? But in terms of the diversity of delegates who are in that top range and also who are able to meet proposal power, I would say is pretty diverse and decentralized in nature.
I think decentralization comes in a variety of different ways. So all the Security Council members are independent of each other. There's no entity that has multiple seats. So you have 12 different entity and individuals that are fully unique. The Guardians have 8 individual participants, and the delegates as well are like all independent entities. Most often, they're participants of the ZKsync ecosystem, and that's really good. And obviously, we're a very new ecosystem, so there's work to do. But if we fast forward, what will this look like in like 5 or 10 years? Well, hopefully like the delegates will represent ZK-Sync chains, ZK-Sync applications, infrastructure providers, individual builders and entrepreneurs, cypherpunk advocates who are aligned with the ZK credo, different developer organizations. And so we should see not just the amount of people participating increase overall. Maybe we won't see the number of delegates with proposal power to increase significantly. I mean, having 30 individuals with proposal power is quite a bit, and it needs to stay like you still need to make sure that global consensus is coordinated in some way. But I do think that the diversity of participants is really important, and something that we don't talk about very often, but something that we were very conscious of, is that the Security Council, for example, has 12 people, and they represent all major jurisdictions legally are around the world in all different time zones. And that's really important. If you really want a 24/7 protocol that is capture resistant across a variety of different actors, including state actors who might have incentives to kind of manipulate the system, you do need that diversity in terms of jurisdictions, time zones, representation, different entities. It's quite critical. So that's a key design principle from our side is, yeah, we want representation, and we also want a good balance between people from all around the world.
Yeah, and I agree with you on decentralization that comes in different forms. On your quote, usually I'm the first person to say we shouldn't just divide everything on black and white and say it's either fully decentralized or not decentralized. And here I am asking Shelby a question: to which extent your delegates or your governance bodies are decentralized? I know it's always tricky, but to me it's also interesting how people define decentralization and whether they view it in a similar way of it being rather a spectrum, or they decide to just have specific criteria of what defines decentralization for them. So it's always very interesting, and I'm being mindful of time, but I really wanted to ask you guys on your token governance model, capped minters. Shelby, could you maybe quickly give us an overview? Why did you choose to move away from the concept of minted treasury and what is a bit more usual that we see in the space, and you move to mint on demand system, if I can call it this way? So it would be great to hear some of the maybe core differences between capped minters and traditional treasuries that we usually see in other ecosystems.
Yeah, I actually will pass this one to Rafa because he was more intimately involved with the design process and decisions on this one. So Rafa, I'll let you kick us off.
I'll talk. I'll talk about the first piece, and maybe you can talk about the token mechanic, kind of how it's evolved. When we were designing the token generation event, there's a lot of questions around how do we do this right, and but the question came up, should we have a treasury? Should we mint all the tokens and then distribute them? But what we actually found out was, I believe it was Gabe Shapiro from MetaLex who made the recommendation of saying, okay, so why cap minters? Why not cap minters? Why don't, instead of minting them, why don't we give rights? Why don't we govern rights instead of asset transfers? And what this means is that the you don't have any pooled funds to begin with, and each airdrop recipient and each token recipient at the token generation event is basically minting the tokens themselves. They have rights for those tokens individually without any sort of pooled funds. And this comes from the cap minter mechanism. You're distributing rights under a cap minter, which means you can mint up to a specific amount, which is the cap. And that means that each person's activity is distinct and not interdependent in terms of the token distributions. This is really great. Well, what I think we didn't know at the time was that this wasn't just good for the token generation event, but it was a very effective way to reframe the protocol governance of the token itself to focus on basically token rights and token mechanics. And so that vision of the cap minter kind of began evolving. And maybe Shelby, you can talk a little bit about how it's moved into a modular kind of framework.
Yeah, happy to. Before I do that, because I'm not 100% sure we actually defined what a cap minter is.
That would be great if we can start by definition.
Yeah. So a cap minter, you can think of a cap minter as just a simple, unique smart contract that enables this just-in-time minting that we've mentioned a few times now. And in this simple smart contract, there's a few parameters that you can set. The main one being the cap, or the limit to the amount of tokens that could be minted within that given contract. Hence why we call it the capped minter. How it works is that anybody who has the minting role on that cat minter is able to mint the tokens up to the cat, is able to mint ZK up to the designated cap for that specific cat minter. Now, how does that tie into governance is also an important piece to mention and clarify. So how you can deploy a cat minter contract. I can deploy one. You could deploy one right now. It wouldn't mean anything. In order for it to be activated, a governance proposal has to be passed that grants the minting rights on that cat minter that will allow the admin or anybody with the minting role on that cat minter to mint from that cat minter. So how our governance looks different from other ecosystems is in other ecosystems, for example, when you pass a governance proposal for token governance, the on-chain action is execution of a transfer. The on-chain action here is granting the minter role on a cat minter or multiple cat minters, depending on the program. So that is kind of like the core, and you can think of the cat minter as like the core building block for what this kind of bigger topic or concept that we're calling token mechanics. So if a cat minter is a simple, unique smart contract, a token mechanic is a combination of additional smart contracts. And those smart contracts put together that interact with each other or maybe set specific rules or limitations on the contracts that they're linked to is what comes together to what we call a token mechanic. And with these token mechanics, you're able to really have a lot of modularity in how you design token distribution or allocation within a specific program from a specific cat minter. How that's evolved over time since launch. So when ZKsync Governance launched in September, we had the cat minter, but
September 2024.
September 2024. So we're still not even a 1 year into the governance system yet. But when we launched in September of 2024, we had the cat minter and we had this vision of token mechanics and this kind of utopia of automation and programmatic enforcement for the deployment of token programs within the ZKsync ecosystem. Over time, in order to demonstrate what a token mechanic is or what it could look like, we started by speaking with existing teams who are already building token mechanics. The concept of a token mechanic or like a smart contract that executes distributions or actions autonomously is obviously not new. And we were able to identify and work with a few different teams to help demonstrate how a cat minter can be hooked up to these existing contracts. What are some examples? HATS protocol, for example. If you want to put eligibility on a cat minter, so if anybody who has a specific hat, for example, would be able to mint from a specific cat minter rather than having like a specific minting role of an individual or a team. The other like kind of examples of types of teams we were talking to and also having come present delegates to help kind of draw this picture of what token mechanics could look like were a variety of streaming or vesting contracts. So drips, Sablier, Hedgie, those kind of projects, you could hook a cat minter up to a distribution contract, a drips contract, a Hedgie contract to mint and distribute the tokens in that way. And as we were going through that process, we had the realization of, it feels like there's still something missing that could make this a lot easier to hook up a cat minter to these other great existing tools. And also there's tools that don't exist yet that would also be nice for us to have. And that's when we started working on this concept of minter mods or like minter modulators that can be hooked up specifically to a cat minter contract. And the examples of those that we've been working on are the rate limiter minter mod, which assigns a limit to how much ZK could be minted from a given cat minter over a certain time period. So imagine you are running a program, a token program, and you have a set of service providers who have to get paid every month. Rather than having a steerco or multisig who's managing that program mint tokens and send it to a service provider every month, that steerco can grant a cat minter to that service provider with a rate limiter on it, and they can pay themselves every month, knowing that there's a cap. They can only mint up to a certain amount in whatever the agreed amount is for the service that's being provided. So that's one example, and that's actually one that where you can actually build yourself right now, or it's been audited and deployed. So that's a really exciting example. Another one is an eligibility mod. So I mentioned the hats example earlier, but the eligibility mod allows you to plug in a little bit easier than it was before. You could do a hats contract, you could do other eligibility requirements more specifically, and there's a few others as well, but just to give you guys an idea of where we are today and where we were when we started, it was more like kind of core building block, cat mentor contract, here it is, and here's the vision, to experimenting with existing tooling, to now building kind of or helping develop our own additional mentor mod contracts to kind of tie all these pieces together. And what we're trying to create here, the outcome of this, is to have like almost like a token mechanics toolkit for people to be able to just look into and take what they need and build together, kind of like a Lincoln log or like a Lego set sort of model of a token mechanic for their token programs.
Before we jump into the wish list of the tooling, that would be great to have. Hopefully we have time to cover that. It's great that you mentioned the HATS protocol, because we're also hoping to have them come to our podcast in one of the upcoming episodes. Before I hand it over to you, Rafa, Shelby, I was just curious on the safeguards. What are their safeguards in place that would prevent abuse of minting rights, if there are any?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the conversation, minting rights are granted through governance. So on cat mentor. So like I said, I could deploy a cat mentor contract right now with a cap of 100 million ZK, and it would be meaningless because I don't have minting rights or the minter role has not been granted on that cat mentor. So not in terms of like account or restriction, anybody can deploy a cat mentor, but only cat mentors who are granted the minter role through governance.
But those rights are being reviewed in a cyclical manner. And sorry for stupid questions like that. But let's say I was a trustworthy agent and now I'm no longer am. What are the safeguards that prevent those or do those checks?
Yeah. So there's two. And the reason I mentioned, again, the granting of minting rights being required in order to mint is that the token assembly can also pass a proposal to revoke those minting rights at any time. So that adds a very legitimate, hard-coded accountability mechanism for the token assembly to pull the plug essentially on any token program, rather than say the community maybe being upset and demanding a proposal to be canceled for whatever reason and maybe passing some sort of vote, but they still are relying on the multisig to send those funds back to a treasury. Or in this case, the tokens aren't minted yet, so the token assembly can basically pull the plug or cancel a program at any time. And the second point actually brings us back to ZK GPS, which we were talking about earlier, and the legal accountability that is with all of the signers on any given multisig who would be an admin or managing a cat minter, a legal contract in place to, again, if they mint the tokens and run, they could get in trouble for that. So those are the two main safeguards.
Also add, so the current version of the cat minter also has what we call pauser role. So most often the way that it's designed is, so token assembly is is delegating rights to mint. So Eugene, Jamilya, you guys have the right to mint up to 100 tokens, maybe up to 10 ZK tokens a month. and your program gets canceled, or you guys decide you want to go to Bermuda for a bit and use your ZK tokens.
Would be
Very
nice.
often, there's what we call a pauser role, and the Security Council is responsible for that pauser role. So you could have minted 10 or 20 ZK, and then maybe you're using the funds not in alignment to the proposal. Well, the Security Council, in this case, if they had been assigned a pauser role, can also pause the cap minter. So there's different configurations here in terms of security. You can add a rate limiter, which provides one layer of security. You can have pauser roles. You can have the token assembly take action. You can have an emergency action take place by the Security Council, similar to like an incident response for a protocol hack or something like that. So there's a variety of different layers. The key thing here is that you're managing rights. And what this means is when you manage rights, it gives you more flexibility because the assets are not in a multi-sig controlled by Eugene and Jamilya. The assets are actually rights inside a contract. And so you can then create controls on those specific rights, which echoes a little bit in terms of what you might do with like multi-sig Zodiac modules in Gnosis. For those who are familiar, Gnosis has different modules that you can add different types of controls in terms of the multi-sig. This is similar, but the controls are upstream in terms of the rights distribution and therefore tightly integrated into the governance process, not in a separate type of toolkit.
Great. Thank you so much, guys, for clarification and just detailed examples. One thing before we jump to our fun quiz part, I wanted to ask you on just like metrics and performance and how do you guys measure it? Because we saw ZK Governance Performance Overview dashboard, and there are some of the metrics, and as we all know it, anyone would know who participates in governance, that there's just so many things like outside of on-chain trackable activity that goes into the performance or just the feeling or, just so many things that just go beyond past numbers. So my question to you guys, how, first of all, you evaluate ZKsync governance performance as of today, summer 2025, and maybe also looking to the future, talking about maybe a wish list of DAO tooling or any things that you don't see quite yet, but in your opinion, that would make your life as governance facilitators easier.
I can start, and Rafa, you can you can add on. So it might sound like a silly one, but given that ZKsync Governance just launched in September of 2024, one of the metrics that we've measured or considered to be a success metric is governance validation. The governance system and contracts as deployed work as they are meant to, and people are able to pass proposals, and the Security Council is able to interact with protocol upgrades, and the Guardians are able to execute a veto, as we've just verified a few weeks ago with a kind of test proposal that we ran with the Guardians. So the governance system has been validated to work as is, and that's one simple, I guess, success metric that we've looked at just because we're in this early stage. Another thing that we have been really happy to see is that the 100% of standard protocol upgrades have gone through the governance process since launch. So on-chain protocol governance is also been validated and it works. And this was this protocol upgradability or protocol sustainability is one of the primary objectives that we were aiming for this year, to have reliable and secure and predictable protocol upgrades for the ZKsync governance system after handing over the keys to the token assembly to be in the governance system to be able to upgrade the ZKsync protocol and keep rolling out cool new features and upgrades. So, and then the other thing that Rafa and I track pretty closely is participation and delegation. as of last month, we were tracking towards around 960 million ZK in active voting power. Active voting power is what how we define active voting power is any delegate who's participated in 2 of the last five votes. And the last time I checked, I think we had around at least 100 delegates with over 100K ZK voting power who voted in the last 2 of 5 votes. So yeah, having that active participation and engagement from delegates in the governance system has also been something we track on this dashboard. If you take a look at it, you'll see there's a ton of metrics for delegate
I was
tracking.
surprised to see that it's an average 3 days that it takes to reach a quorum. I'm feeling it's quite short amount of time considering just other ecosystem examples. What do you think, Rafa?
The main thing that we want is we want protocol upgrades to work seamlessly, right? And okay, so how do we make that happen? Well, A, you need to be able to hit quorum consistently, and B, you want to minimize the risk that a valid vote didn't necessarily reach quorum because people forgot to vote, right? You want to avoid those situations. So that's why Alicia recommended we start tracking kind of like time to quorum. This time to quorum is really powerful because you can kind of compare it with the total voting window. In our case, the voting periods are 7 days. So you want your time to reach quorum to not be 6 days on average, right? You want it to be like 2 to 3 days, 3 to 4 days max. What we're trying to do is we're trying to find ways, trying to identify the frictions that actually lead to that delay in voting process. It should be as easy as possible to vote, and you should be well educated in each of the proposals as a delegate by the time you reach the portal to make a decision on whether to vote or not. So there's a lot of front loading that we're doing. Like I know there's a proposal coming up very likely next week, so we want to make sure that the proposal sponsor and the proposal team are posting it on the forum with plenty of time. They're doing the rounds, educating people, answering questions, and everybody knows when the vote starts and are ready to vote as soon as possible. That's kind of what we're aiming for. Obviously, there's no silver bullet. There's simply a list of 1,000 small little things that cause like delays. And when you solve one at a time, actually the benefits compound. One little known thing is, if our vote period is 7 days, you want to minimize starting a vote on Friday afternoon, and you want to make, because then you lose potentially 2 days over the weekend. So you want to make sure that the vote starts maybe on Tuesday, so that you have momentum in terms of the voting process. So there's a lot of, it's death by 1,000 cuts or time to quorum by 1,000 improvements. And it's still the first year, but we're hoping we'll get that as seamless as possible. And part of that is like voting on mobile, accessibility, education, simplifying.
I was about to ask you what's the future of governance in terms of tooling, and if we were to meet up in the same great company a year from now, do you think that governance will evolve in a similar way that, ZKsync governance is set up with legal wrappers, opt-in membership, enforceable on-chain actions? So do you think that would become the norm, or you'll see wider divergence on how protocol handle their compliance and liability?
I think that maybe this is a hot take, but I potentially think we're at the highest level of complexity for governance in terms of the story arc of governance processes. I think it's all simplification from here. As we had the Genius Act pass earlier this week, Clarity Act in the US is coming through. There's new definitions that are coming into play, and I hope that through this process, what we're seeing in terms of macro trend is clarity in terms of what actually constitutes a decentralized system and what constitutes an accountable system, both from a legal and on-chain perspective. So code and law, or protocol and law, or lawful protocols, one might say. Even if they are cross-jurisdiction international mechanisms, what we should try to do is simplify. So I think I'm hoping that even though protocol complexity and power will increase, the governance systems of these protocols will decrease in both risks, decrease in terms of risk, with increased security, with increased proper participation for decentralization. I am hoping for further simplification. And I think part of ZKsync will be to pursue further simplification.
Thank you so much. And I wish we could continue just talking and talking, but I'm mindful of time. Yes, Eugene, over to you.
Yeah, so just to wrap up this episode, we like doing a little quiz where we'll be asking both of you the same question and ask that each of you please keep your answers to one word. And Shelby, I'll start with you for the first one. How would you describe governance at ZKsync in one word?
Technical.
You always put me on. I know you told me that this question was coming, and I'm still unprepared for it. Some word association. Okay, ZKsync governance is the standard.
Okay. What do you see as the vibe in DAOs these days? One word.
Frustrated.
Institutionalized.
And now to switch the order, so Rafa, if you don't mind going first for the last two, what's an idea that you wish more of those who are building and designing DAOs? What's an idea that you wish they would keep in mind when they sit down to start designing the DAO?
Less is more.
Governance
Or don't innovate.
service minimization.
It's one word, Shelby.
Hyphenated.
A lot of hyphens in that answer. And then the last question for both of you. What is the future of governance in one word?
Regulated.
Experimental.
Well, yeah, we appreciate you both taking the time. I feel like we easily could have filled another hour on conversation here, but we both appreciate you for taking the time to chat with us today and for all the work that y'all are doing.
Thank you, guys. It was
Thank
amazing.
you guys. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for tuning in. The Governance Futures podcast is sponsored by the Scroll Foundation and produced by the governance team at the foundation, Eugene Leventhal and Jamilya Kamalova, with editing support from Hridesh Sapkota. Any music and photos are attested in the episode description. If you'd like to get in touch, reach out over Twitter at gov_futures, or you can email us at governance@scroll.io. Until next time.